Thank you for the invite from the Indie Heme Review. I don't have a disclosure slide, but I am a full-time employee of Genentech Roche. Can you guys all hear me okay? Okay, perfect. So now I feel a little bit awkward starting my slide with a problem statement.
Just 1 minute.
But I have mostly solutions in my deck, so this will be helpful. Okay, here we go. So a lot of the conversation I heard this morning is actually really stimulating and exciting for me. So I'm going to try to do my best because I heard a lot of common themes across the spectrum of providers that I'm going to try to tie back into this just to kind of, again, showcase that there is a lot of alignment from the industry side as well. So the problem statement here I think is pretty universal. How do we conduct clinical trials so that they fully represent diverse patient populations? We know that the problem statement is that medications aren't really thoroughly examined for safety, efficacy, and accessibility for marginalized or all demographic groups. And therefore, at the end of the day, we talked about real-world data, someone mentioned that earlier, but the outcomes of clinical trials really remain sort of uncertain for these patient populations. So at Roche, again, I can speak from an industry sponsor perspective that we do strive to ensure that all populations are represented in biopharma research and development by a term that we call AIR, Advancing Inclusive Research. So we don't use diversity, fortunately, in our phrase around diversity in clinical trials, but we do use the term inclusive research. And so the term AIR comes from Advancing Inclusive Research. So the proposed solution that we have sort of adopted as an industry, again, across the Roche Genentech enterprise, probably for the last 4 years or so, is that we've proposed building a comprehensive and unified set of principles that address these inclusive research gaps. Again, to be adopted by all levels of the organization across the enterprise through Genentech and Roche across the entire clinical development timeline. So I'm going to introduce the 5 principles, or what we lovingly call the 5 Ps framework. The 5P framework is a end-to-end, measurable, very transparent definition of clinical trial representativeness that can function within organizational constraints. I know that's a mouthful, and I will break all that down for you. But again, when I speak to organizational constraints, I do mean that from an internal perspective. Obviously pharma is a very highly regulated industry. We have a lot of operational constraints, but also externally, right? Like we are in the business of drug development, which means that we are in the business of running global multi-regional clinical trials. So there's a lot of, again, operational considerations that we have to think about from an external perspective. When we go to countries outside the US, infrastructures might not be there. We have to respect local laws, local considerations. Even things like, supply chain, for example. A lot of our oncolytics need to be refrigerated. How do we ship those things to countries that maybe don't have that sort of infrastructure or capacity to sort of hold those types of drugs? So that's what I sort of mean by organizational constraints. So I want to introduce the 5 Ps of advancing inclusive research, so the 5 Ps of AIR. And I'm just going to sort of go over this, like as I almost view this as a table of contents. We'll go through the 5 principles, and then I'll spend a little bit more time digging deeper into each of the principles. So the first principle is around the WHO, and this is the population health principle. So we want to know who are we trying to treat with the disease or condition. And when Dr. Wingfield spoke this morning, this is really sort of what resonated for me as well, because this is where we want to start with. Who are we trying to treat? Who are these patients? What are the biological considerations? What are the genetic and demographic considerations that we need to think about for this particular patient population? Once we know the who, we can anchor on the second principle. Where are these patients located? Where do we go to reach those representative patient cohorts? And we break this principle down, the where, into 3 sub-principles, which again I'll talk about in a bit. Once we know who and where we're going to place these clinical trials, we can then start to design a clinical trial that's, again, end-to-end, very inclusive in the way that we're thinking about, inclusion criteria, for example. So this end-to-end piece around inclusive trial design has 2 components. One of it, which is data-driven. We heard a lot this morning, too, about that data-driven piece around inclusion, exclusion criteria. The second piece, which I get really excited about, is it being user-informed, is also reaching out to different stakeholders outside, patients, investigators, et cetera, to get input on the clinical trial design. The fourth principle focuses on why me. So this really focuses on data collection standards. So we know that that can vary across the world as well. So we've created data harmonization standards around different questionnaires, and I'll show you what that looks like here in a little bit. But we've also, focused on that as a principle, as a standalone principle, because that's very, very critical. And the last principle, and this is really close to my heart, I've heard a lot about it this morning as well, is how. How are we getting these patients access to trials? And again, we're in the business of doing global clinical trials, so that could look very differently in the United States versus in other countries. So with that, I will focus back on principle one, which is the who, and the population health considerations. So who are the patients with the disease? So we definitely want to think about epidemiology, again, the incidence and prevalence and where these patients, and who these patients are in terms of prevalence and incidence, but we also want to think about the biological and genetic considerations. So we want to think about ancestries, we want to think about biomarkers, we want to think about risk factors, et cetera. We also want to think about disparities in diagnosis, disease characteristics and progression, treatment patterns and standard of care. We know standard of care looks very different in the US than it could maybe for India. We also want to think about morbidity and mortality and quality of care. Another piece of population health, also discussed at length this morning, is the demographic considerations. So that's race and ethnicity and age and sex. I call those out under two separate bullets because it looks very differently again in the US versus outside of the US. So race and ethnicity, for example, outside the US doesn't hold a lot of weight. It doesn't hold a lot of meaning. They put a lot more clout into age and sex. And age for countries in Europe, for example, really focuses on pediatrics and geriatrics. And for sex, it really focuses on female. So that's how they sort of describe health inequities, is from an age and sex perspective. So we have, again, in looking at this principle around population health, at Roche Genentech, we do create and develop these disease area population analysis reports that really sort of collate all of this information around a particular disease, and we have over 20 of these developed now across therapeutic areas that we share with each of the study teams so that as they're designing clinical trials, they know exactly who the patient population is that they're dealing with. The second principle is around the where. And where, this is again, where do we reach those representative patient cohorts? And again, I think Dr. Winfield talked about the fit for purpose. So we want to go to where those patients are that have the highest morbidity and mortality and prevalence. So this is, I sort of see this as a where in terms of this principle being three-tiered. We want to start really broad and start with the region. Where are those patients located from a regional perspective? There's a couple of different data sources that you can use to identify the epidemiology data for this. Again, it's going to look different. Those sources are going to look different for the US, which is predominantly US cancer statistics, and also SEER data. But that isn't as relevant for outside of the US. For outside of the US, we use the Global Burden of Disease Study, as well as the ICH-17 guidelines around multiple regional clinical trials, and that's how we sort of map where the patients are, again, those that have the disease, to global trial enrollment and where we place the trials. The second tier on where to reach representative cohort is in the country itself. So now if we know like the North Americas is the region we want to focus on, or the European region, we can focus on a country level of where we want to go to enable access and commercialization. But again, this one really you have to respect the local laws and the local infrastructure. So that stands alone as a principle itself. And then the last but not least, which I think is one of the most important ones, is the representative real-world population. So this is at the site level. So the data will tell us something, but maybe when we go to the actual community in the catchment area, it's going to tell us something very different. So this is definitely part of sub-principle 2 of where to reach those patient cohorts. The other thing that I'll mention, I know the FDA is not in the room, but the other thing that I'll mention is principles 1 and 2, so this is the where and the who. Those two combined will help inform, from an industry perspective, what we put into our diversity action plan to submit to the FDA. So again, this is done very intentionally to sort of inform the diversity inclusion goals. And around the goal setting guidance, we have information around that. We also have developed a diversity action template from an industry perspective. We also have external resources like the AIR calculator. I think calculators were mentioned earlier this morning. We've published one as well to help us set goal enrollment targets for diversity inclusion. And then we also have other publications like the R-Index that help us guide and hold us accountable to these target setting goals to make sure that we meet our enrollment targets. Principle 3 is around what considerations now do we include in the protocol design. So this is, again, data-driven, and it's also user-informed. The data-driven piece is really evolving, and it's interesting because we're now able to use a lot of AI algorithms to sort of, combine with real-world data to look at how we can improve the eligibility criteria in a clinical trial design. So, there's a data source called Clinical Trial Pathfinder, which we can sort of play with those numbers and expand the value ranges of certain lab parameters, and you can see that that does not change or offset the statistical analysis design or the safety outcomes. So using tools like that, we can sort of, again, broaden the range of what we're expecting with lab values to allow more patients to enroll. The last one I want to say is, again, the user-informed piece, which is something I think everyone in this room is really passionate about. One thing that we're also directing all of the study teams internally is to include input from providers, patient and patient advocacy groups, and investigators on study trial designs. So there is actually, I'm happy to say, about a year ago, there was a new Roche PD or global mandate that all new protocols to be finalized by Q1 of last year had to be developed with consideration for the patient. And we have different patient frameworks in place to make sure that that patient input or investigator input is included in the study protocol design. The fourth principle is around patient-reported data collection standards. And Dr. Lunning, you actually mentioned this earlier as well, and so did Maya, actually. And when we talked about the case report form, a lot of these new race and ethnicity categories have come up from the US OMB. I'm proud to say that we actually did implement this years before even the FDA OMB guidance came out, but we have expanded the race and ethnicity categories. But what I love about this is we've also expanded the subcategories. So now even when you have, for example, Hispanic or Latino, you've got the subcategories of Mexican, Puerto Rican, El Salvadorian, Cuban, Dominican, and so forth. For Black, you have African American, you have African Caribbean, you have Black African, and I have to say that we don't have anything that says unknown. So this is great because we've got our new CRF, and every single study that's being implemented at Roche Genentech has this new electronic case report form in all of our studies globally. And it helps us harmonize the data as well as when we look to collect this. I'm also happy to report that we have also included some SOGI questions, and again, this is optional. All of this is self-reported, but a couple of the US studies where we know that SOGI is definitely more on the radar. We've had 3 studies in our pivotal trials now include optional SOGI questionnaires around what is your sexual orientation, what is your current gender identity. So again, we only have 3 studies that now have included this as part of the protocol, but hoping to have more in the next couple of years. And then we talked about socioeconomic status, but social determinants of health. So several of our studies, I think there's about 10 now of our pivotal studies, now actually ask questions around education, employment status, health insurance status. What type of insurance do you have? Is it private, commercial, Medicare, Medicaid, and so forth? What is the household income status? What is your marital status? And then, of course, your zip code of home residence, which we know is associated with disparities as well. So this is, again, another standard that we're trying to implement as part of data collection. And then the last principle is around, again, maximizing patient access to trials. One thing that we always hear pushback from, and we heard this from a lot of agencies, is that, well, you guys are the pharmaceutical industry. We know that you only place trials where you know you'll make the most money. So I'm just here to dispel that myth, that we will actually, it's an ethical and fundamental question, and that we, as a position, our CEO has stated this, that a fundamental and ethical aspect of study placement and access for Roche and Genentech is that we will only conduct trials in countries where there is a sustainable path to getting those drugs actually approved and available for those patients. So I want to just kind of dispel that myth as first and foremost. Second, I want to also mention that we do have position statements around post-trial access reimbursement programs. So when we are in countries where we're setting up a trial and patients are on that drug, once the trial ends, if the patient still requires that drug, we have programs in place that will still allow that patient to get that, even if there's no regulatory approval yet available in that country for that drug. We have also invested in a lot of partnerships, logistical partnerships like Uber and things like that, or transportation within clinical trials. And then the last piece that I want to mention and highlight around maximizing patient access to trials, and Dr. Lenning, you described this as well, was the mistrust. I think this is a huge component to maximizing patient access to trials. You can give a patient everything and throw everything at them in terms of logistics and all of that, but if they don't trust in the healthcare system, they don't trust in providers and in pharmaceutical companies, even in the FDA and the CDC, as we saw during COVID, it's all for nothing. So I think this is a huge part of this sub-principle around maximizing patient access to trials. It's always a difficult thing to implement, but at the end of the day, I think we don't want to show up as a transactional partner. We want to really be there for the community. We want to really be there for the patients. As part of that, we have implemented a program called EPSS, which is Enhanced Patient Support Services. This is a program that's implemented for everyone that's in our clinical trials in the US. And it's a very well-defined catalog of invoiceable services for patients depending on their need. So it could be a list of services pre-enrollment around clinical trial education, either transportation, translation services, whatever it is, whether it's pre-study, on the study, or afterwards. But this has been built into every single clinical study budget template for all the US studies. It's also implemented in the UK and in Canada. And the site is the one who actually determines who is best to receive these types of services. So again, we leave that to the discretion of the investigator or the provider and the patient. And the rates really depend on the seniority of the role performing the services. So each patient is allocated about $2,500 to $2,900 US, again, at the discretion of the provider and depending on who is performing that service. So again, it's one step in terms of building that trust for these patients. So I want to just pull through or show how we sort of pull through some of these principles in real time, right? So we have clinical trial program and clinical developments and a lot of oncolytic agents. So I want to show you 2 use cases, oncology and 1 in non-oncology. So this particular use case is in multiple myeloma. So principle 1 is, who are the patients most affected by multiple myeloma? So again, we look at all the patient demographics by age, race, sex, and so forth, and then we look at their patient risk factors. So we know, and we discussed it this morning, for multiple myeloma, it's 2 to 3 times higher incidence in African Americans than Caucasians. From a gender perspective, 1.5 times higher in men than women. So according to this and other factors that I'm not going over here, principle 2 goes to where are these patients that are most affected by multiple myeloma. And you can see the heat map of where we've placed the clinical trials, all the pivotal studies, based on what we learned from that population health piece of this. So once we've placed those sites, then we can sort of move on to principle 3 and design the protocol, again, to make sure that we're thinking about those patients from a local perspective, broadening inclusion and exclusion criteria for late-stage studies, optimizing patient visits, and so forth. And that's some of the things that we've done for our multiple myeloma trials. Principle 4 and 5, again, why are we focusing on these patients? And we've included and implemented these electronic case report forms and different questionnaires for data collection purposes, and then maximizing access to these trials. This example is in breast cancer. I won't go into it too much because I know that Dr. Schneider spent a lot of time on this earlier today. So again, from a principle 1 perspective, who are the patients most affected by breast cancer? Once we have a really good standing on that, we can move to principle 2. So where are these patients affected by it? And then you can see we specifically placed these clinical trial studies globally based on where these patients were. And then principle 3 is, again, user-informed, end-to-end inclusive trial design. I particularly like what this study team did. They actually went out to the community and asked for feedback around the trial design. One of the impacts that we heard here was that to then include male patients in breast cancer trials. So that was something that we hadn't really thought too much about. So that was something in an amendment that we were able to make then as part of the inclusion and eligibility criteria. And then principle 4 and 5 are pretty similar around access. And then the last one is COPD. Again, this is a non-oncology use case, but I wanted to introduce this one because in terms of who are the patients affected most by COPD, we looked at the traditional demographic factors, but in this one for COPD, we also looked at environmental exposures. So again, depending on the disease, there's different things that you're gonna wanna consider in terms of evaluating risk. And then based on that, move on to principle 2 and make sure you have a very data-driven country and site selection approach. Principle 3, again, what will that COPD clinical trial design look like? And in this particular one, because there was a lot of countries that were, poorer countries that didn't have access to a lot of care. They integrated mobile nursing units in these trials, offering more than 80% of these visits to be held locally. So it's things like that that we can then amend based on what we know from Principle 1 and 2. So I'll close with saying that the 5P AIR framework, principles 1, 2, and 3 are very variable. They are very dependent upon the disease condition, and that's where we really want to spend a lot of energy and investment, is understanding who these patients are, where they need to be, or where they are, and then decide, how do we want to design these studies. 4 and 5 are less dynamic. These strategies are less dependent on the disease-specific factors and can be more scalable. And then I'll just end there, but I just wanted to ask if there was any thoughts, or I know we're going to open it up for questions in a bit. Perfect. Thank you.